and introduction of the audience. I'll start. I'm Jordan Hess with City Council. Shane?
Shane Stack, voting proxy for Ed Taves, Montana Department of Transportation.
Don MacArthur, Missoula Urban Transportation District.
Dave Strohmeyer, Missoula County Commissioner.
John Engen, Mayor of the City of Missoula.
Thank you. We have minutes from November 20th. I'd entertain a motion to approve or amend those. Thank you, Mayor. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Thank you, Shane. Any discussion on the motion or public comment? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And any opposed? Motion passes. Is there any public comment on items not on our agenda? Just come on up to the microphone and please state your name for the record.
Oh, no, you're good. Thank you, Erin. Over at ORI, over at the fairgrounds, over at Garden City, Montessori, everywhere in that area. So we think this is a great opportunity for a positive change and a safer corridor, and we would love to help be part of a solution. So thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Kat. I appreciate your comments. And I wanted to just update that the city is working with MDT on some initiating some safety audits there. I think there's a lot of opportunity to get something done, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you. Any additional public comment? Okay, we have two items of new business. The first is the presentation of the Missoula in Motion strategic plan for 2019 through 2023.
All right, I'm Catherine Auger with Missoula in Motion. Thanks for having me. I'm here to talk about the strategic plan that we just completed earlier this year for Missoula in Motion. As you know, Missoula in Motion is an organization dedicated to increasing the use of sustainable transportation here in Missoula. We've been around since 1997, and we have changed quite a bit over the years and adapted to maintain relevancy. We are funded through congestion mitigation air quality funds. And something to note about the plan is that it not only covers Missoula in Motion, but also the components of the bicycle pedestrian program that are also funded by CMAQ. Those programs overlap quite a bit, so it made sense to look at them all together. All right. So why do a strategic plan right now? We made that decision. If you look at our previous plans, you can see we were pretty due for one. Our last one was completed in 2012. But the transportation options field is always changing, so we really want to maintain relevancy, ensure that our work is having the impact that we intend. Also, technology is changing, so ensuring that we're utilizing that as best as possible. We also know that Missoula is growing very rapidly right now, so we wanted to ensure that we are providing the best services possible and impacting transportation as it grows. And also, as you know, Missoula in the 2016 Long Range Transportation Plan adopted ambitious mode split goals. So those roughly triple the rates of people commuting by foot and bike, quadruple the rate of people riding the bus to work, and reduce the drive alone commute rate by half, all by 2045. So MIMS education and encouragement programs are crucial to realize such a significant shift in the community's travel behaviors, and we wanted to ensure that we are on track with that as well. And so, as I mentioned, the transportation options field is always changing. The most significant shift in recent years has been informed by the social sciences and what we know about what makes a person actually change their behavior. So, because that's essentially what we're doing, we're trying to get people to shift their behavior from driving alone in a car for all of their trips to considering and starting to use sustainable modes for at least some of them. So with that in mind, we look to what's called the stages of continuum, and that offers a framework by which professionals can evaluate individuals and their readiness to make a behavior change. They then develop strategies tailored to individuals within each of the 5 different stages. And so shifting away from a one-size-fits-all approach to a more nuanced focus, which takes into account an individual's specific needs, has really become the standard for how transportation options programs are structured. And the most effective programs today really emphasize staff time spent one-on-one with individuals, and then they also evaluate success not only by how many people are actually using sustainable modes, but also how many individuals move from one stage along the continuum to the next stage. So this is something that we refer to a lot. It's something that is informing a lot of our programs, and not only how we implement programs, which is focusing more one-on-one, tailoring to individuals' needs, but also how we evaluate programs. So looking at that more nuanced understanding of where people are along the continuum and how we can move them. Some goals for our process was our overall outcome was just to enhance transportation options services and assure that we maintain a high quality of service regardless of staff turnover or any changes in external factors. And then a couple other things to note. We also looked at our staffing roles and updated those. And then because evaluation and reporting is such an important part of what we do, we also really dug into that and came up with some new ways to evaluate programs. So we put out an RFP for the strategic planning process. We decided on Community Forward Consulting, a local group to work with. And as you can see, we went through a pretty extensive process. It started with information gathering and then also evaluation of current programs. We had 13 different meetings with internal and external stakeholders with 18 individuals. So that's an overview of the process. And when looking at all of our programs, as you can see, throughout one calendar year, we do a lot of different programs at Missoula in Motion. We recognize that we don't necessarily have adequate time and resources to continue doing all of these programs at the level that we're doing them, and also add on some of the new programs that we think would be really impactful here in the community. So when evaluating the programs, we came up with some criteria in order to prioritize which ones we should continue, which we should scale up, and which we should focus on less. So we looked at feasibility. How feasible is it for us to do this project within the staffing and funding resources that we have currently? The impact of the programs, how effectively does the program normalize sustainable transportation, shift culture, or enact behavior change within our target audience? We looked at measurability, how well can you actually measure that impact and report out on it? And then the capacity, for each one, is it cost intensive, is it staff time intensive, and how does that fit into the other programs that we're doing? So from there, we developed 5 different goals and 5-year goals with annual targets to ensure that we're on track to reach those over that timeline. So the first one being our Way to Go Missoula program. That is a platform that we use to encourage individuals to use sustainable transportation and to discover all of their transportation options. And so we use the online platform to support a lot of our programs, but then it's also kind of its own program where we interface with individuals. And so one conclusion that we reached is that this program could best serve people who are new to Missoula. It has a pretty effective trip planning section where it allows you to see how you can get from your house to, your frequented locations that you travel to often, and your different options, and compares them all. So we are choosing to focus and work with some local partners to reach out to people who are new to Missoula. We also know that's a really good time to influence behavior change, since people don't already have habits established. They're in a new place, and so they're creating new habits. And we also will continue to partner with local businesses to offer rewards and incentives to people for logging sustainable trips. And secondly, our Way to Go from Workplaces program, we've heard from a lot of our constituents that were interviewed during the information gathering process that this is what they feel is our most impactful program. So we will continue to grow this program and really emphasize working with employers to reach out to their employees to influence their commute behaviors. We think normalizing sustainable transportation within the culture of a workplace is a really great way to influence commute behavior among employees. We will have 2 commuter challenges that we'll do every year. We'll continue to do our community-wide one in the spring, and then also have one focused on the UM campus. And we will also focus more on doing our workplace assessments, where we tailor our services. We do evaluations and individual surveys with specific employers, often that come to us that have parking problems, and so we kind of provide free consulting services to work with them to get a program up and running at their workplace. And often the commuter challenge is a great way to get a contact of those employers, and then we can kind of build a relationship from there and offer more focused services. And lastly, we offer mini grants for infrastructure projects for workplaces that maybe can't afford to install covered bike parking or get lockers for active commuters. So we'll continue to engage in that program. And individualized marketing is a new program. The bicycle pedestrian program and Missoula in Motion have been really interested in getting a door-to-door canvassing individualized marketing program up and running for several years. We just have never been able to identify enough staffing resources to actually have that come to fruition. So it's providing this service is very resource intensive, but there's really strong evidence that focusing these one-on-one efforts is highly effective in achieving that long-term behavior change. So in order to make this happen, we are focusing on reallocating some of our resources. Part of that will be potentially reassigning the bicycle ambassador positions, which the Bike Ped office has. And then also working within our existing CMAQ funding to allocate more resources to staff time. And so we were able to bump up our program assistant position. It used to be half-time Missoula in Motion, half-time MPO. So we just hired John, who just started last week, and he'll be full-time Missoula in Motion. So that will really increase our capacity to complete this program. And the way that we were able to do that within our existing budget is by scaling down some of our kind of mass advertising costs, so reducing print ads and radio ads, and just scaling down other things that are higher in cost but lower in staff time, to shifting to this program, which is very staff intensive, but really the costs associated with this program are pretty minimal otherwise. So we think that that will be more effective use of our resources. And we've already started developing this program, and it will hopefully we'll be launching a pilot program this summer. So our fourth focus area are events. We still see events as very important in shifting culture, enacting behavior change, and also celebrating successes and just fostering this community of sustainable transportation within Missoula. So we will continue to engage in our event-based education and outreach, but we've decided to shift in priorities and look at some of our events and continue the ones that we see as most impactful and kind of steer away from the ones that are maybe just rewarding the people that are doing it anyways and not really shifting people along that continuum. But we have some local partners that we've started to meet with that can hopefully take on some of these events, since they are very successful and well loved in the community. So we're hoping that our partner advocacy organizations can take on the actual planning and management and coordinating of these events. So we're in the process of doing that. And then lastly, our final focus area is school outreach. So we know that a significant number of commute trips are parents driving their students to school. And so while we think this is an important component, we also realize that within the current limitations of our funding and our staff, we probably don't have enough resources to really create a new school outreach program. It's not something that we're really doing currently. We have, however, partnered with different organizations. So there are other partners in the community that are looking at the school commute. So Let's Move Missoula and Free Cycle. So we'll continue to kind of work with them and support their efforts. But we probably won't scale up our school outreach efforts unless we were to get additional funding and resources. But we do realize that a lot of our other programs touch on that, since many of our Commuter Challenge participants are parents that are driving their kids to school. And then, also just with our individual outreach programs, we will likely encounter a lot of families and also talk about kids walking to school and things like that. So lastly, we did look at staff changes. So in order to kind of execute this strategic plan over the next 5 years, we identified the need for strong leadership, someone to kind of create work plans, scale down certain programs, and make those decisions to change things and do them differently from the way we've been doing them for several years. So we created a program coordinator position that will offer day-to-day management of the program. That will include monitoring work plans, training and hiring new staff, identifying staff training needs, and then probably most importantly, monitoring and measuring the successes of not only the individual program elements, but also the elements all together as a whole and how they're moving us toward our goals. And then, as I mentioned before, the other significant staffing change was that program assistant position, so bumping that up to a full-time Missoula in Motion staff is something that we were able to do. And then also just clarifying a clear path and a career ladder for staff to move forward, and we hope that that will ultimately reduce turnover. So that is an overview of our strategic plan, but I'll open it up for any questions.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Appreciate it. Any questions or comments? Dave?
Yeah, thanks for your presentation and the work that you do. Could you talk a little bit more about the success of the rewards program or not, and just how you measure success with that particular program?
Sure. So with our, we do monthly challenges where we encourage people to log sustainable trips, and we partner with different local businesses to sponsor every month. So if you log, and we try and make it attainable for someone that maybe does have a lot of barriers to using sustainable transportation. So even if you can only commute sustainably and log one trip a week, then you are able to select a different incentive. So it's like a $5 voucher to a different local business or something like that. So we have seen success in that program. It's definitely a hook to get people to start logging their trips, and that data that is provided from people who log their trips regularly is really valuable to us. We can see where people are going and coming from, what mode they're using, whether people commute sustainably more in the winter and the summer, and that sorts of things. And so that program has shifted from one that we used to fund with CMAQ funding to kind of be able to purchase incentives. And now we've switched it to partnering with local businesses and soliciting donations. And so that's also been really effective in just creating partnerships and raising awareness of sustainable transportation when within these businesses, and creating partnerships and creating advocates so that, these organizations are now promoting our message to their customers as well, because they're also co-promoting the programs with us.
Do you know offhand just roughly how many people participate in the program?
It certainly depends on the time of year, but I think currently we have around 100 people that are claiming incentives every month. We have more people that are logging trips, but maybe don't necessarily care about the incentives. During the spring, we probably will have double or triple that in some months.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Another thing we offer with logging trips too, and kind of with the incentives program, is our guaranteed ride home program. And so if you commute sustainably to work and something comes up unexpectedly, we can cover your ride back home from your workplace in the evening for up to 12 times per year. So that's seen by a lot of people as really valuable because it gives you that cushion. A lot of people are afraid to, leave their car at home because they have kids in school. What if I have a sick kid? I have to go pick them up. This allows kind of people that flexibility to do that without having to worry about the cost. But you have to log your trips in order to gain access to that.
Mayor?
A couple of things. Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all of you for working on this. I think the event stuff, I think offloading that, brilliant strategy. I'm interested in tell me a bit about the prioritization with schools, limited capacity. To me, that's a captive audience at a pretty influential time in their lives. So apart from Free Cycles, who are other partner organizations?
Let's Move Missoula.
Okay.
So yeah, and I think a big part of that is previously there was federal funding for the Safe Routes to School program, which no longer exists. So that is a program that is pretty resource intensive because to run a Safe Routes to School program, you have to have people staffed at each of the 5 routes for each school in the mornings. And to have an effective program, the evidence shows that it has to run over an extended period of time. You can't just, just having one or once a month isn't even as effective. So, yeah, I think because it is so resource intensive, we haven't been able to identify where we could fit that in without sacrificing some of our other programs. Like workplaces, which we think are more impactful and sometimes easier to measure. But yeah, Let's Move Missoula is making that link between active transportation. Okay. And then Free Cycles does quite a bit. They do 10 events per year with different schools, and it's often bike skills and bike routes and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay. I also appreciate the move away from events. I think that those events have their place, but I do think that it's a great idea to come up with a nonprofit partner or a community partner to participate in those. I've been following some of the individualized marketing trends around the country and think there's a lot of promise there, and I'm really glad that you've included those. That one-on-one engagement is just such a good way to get people to change their behavior. And I think it's important that we look at the broader context that if we talk about the marginal cost of adding a new commuter via any mode, it's like the old energy adage that the cheapest, in this case, the cheapest trip is the trip not taken by car. By shifting a very small percentage of people into other modes, we can make our entire transportation system run significantly more efficiently. So I think you've got a lot of really great direction in the plan and a lot of ambitious goals that are very much measurable goals. So I applaud you for that. I did have one question, and that was you touched on something about information on maybe working with realtors or can you, and it is a great idea to have information on kind of personalized trip planning for, on house sale or on apartment lease, or can you talk a little bit more about your work in that?
Yeah, and that's something that we hasn't fully come to fruition yet as to how that will look, but we're open to suggestions. Our thoughts at this point to reach that audience would be, to work with realtors, possibly even property managers, and just being able to provide resources. I'll encourage them to let people know about our services. And And then also potentially working even with some banks and the loaning officers for mortgages, and really encouraging people to have the conversation of what the impact of transportation costs on a household, and how that relates to where you live. So getting people to think about that. We know that transportation is often the second highest family or household cost, second to housing. And sometimes you may spend more on a house that is, more central, but you can save significant money by going from 2 cars to 1 car because you're on a bus route. So coming up with some sort of even brochure to have the banks have handy that they can share with people, and kind of start those conversations there for people that are either new to Missoula or even just relocating. So yeah, those are some of our thoughts on how we can start that, but we're open to suggestions.
Okay, great. I think it's a great idea. Just anecdotally from my work on campus, we find that a lot of students will relocate from maybe living on campus or near campus, and then they sign a lease out on Expressway, and they don't realize that they are not proximate to a bus route until they've moved in and there's no bus.
Right.
And getting out ahead of that, I think, is really important. So I appreciate that. Any additional questions or discussion, or any public or staff comment? Okay, thank you. Appreciate the update. We will move on to the presentation and review of the draft pedestrian facilities master plan. And I want to mention that this is a very timely update. As many of you know, Mayor Engen and the City Council have been considering how to make some meaningful changes to our sidewalk program, and those questions came up at a very opportune time as Aaron and his team were really wrapping up a year of really good work on this pedestrian facilities plan. So I'll turn it over to you, Aaron, unless Mayor Engen, do you want to add anything else before we jump in? Okay, Aaron.
All right, well, thanks. Yeah, like Jordan said, I think this is a very opportune time, and hopefully the focus that sidewalks have had in the news and the community will bring people into this process, even though we are sort of trying to wrap things up and get this draft plan out. We're always happy to have additional comments. People read through the draft plan, identify deficiencies in it or areas where we can make improvements. So even though we have a draft plan, we're hoping to have it adopted in the near future. Up until it's adopted, there's always opportunity to make those changes and make it better. Even after it's adopted, we'll come back to this plan regularly, like all of our plans, and evaluate it and make updates. So hopefully this is a good timing that we will, I hope, be answering a number of the questions that have come up recently through the work that we've been doing. So I just want to start with an overview of the goals of what we're trying to achieve with this plan. These are related to other community goals. When we look at this infrastructure level planning, the goal is to try to help support the other plans, such as the long-range transportation plan, our growth policy, health planning that's going on in the community. And so we drew on all of those other plans to develop the list of goals that are in this infrastructure plan, and then using those as the foundation on how we develop a strategy to implement the plan or what we're trying to achieve in terms of infrastructure. So there's a wide range of goals, from safety to health and equity to looking at land use and community design and how all of those things are related and how pedestrian infrastructure can really affect those and vice versa. Another key part of this is the mode split goals. We adopted these in the last long-range transportation plan. Catherine mentioned them as part of the MIM strategic plan. It's definitely part of all of our infrastructure plans as well. If we're going to meet those very ambitious goals in the future, we're going to have to do better, I think, at all levels, whether that's infrastructure or education, outreach, engagement. And so this plan is essentially the infrastructure piece for the pedestrian mode split. So if you look at this graph, our current pedestrian mode split hovers around 6 to 7% of people commuting to work or school. Our goal is to get up around 18%. That's a pretty big change, but again, if we...
So that's ambitious, but can you highlight just how impressive 6 to 7% is relative to national figures?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think, let me, is the next, I think I've got a slide that shows where we're at compared to the rest of the country. But yeah, our current mode split is very good compared to the rest of the country, and so we're trying to do even better. And in order to do better, in terms of our mode split goal, we're going to have to be more ambitious in our plans and our policies. So that's driving a lot of what we have in this plan. We also have a lot of focus on health and equity. The Invest Health team has done a lot of work in neighborhoods around Missoula looking at the linkages and the drivers behind persistent poverty, health disparities in our different neighborhoods. And very early in that process, sidewalks or the lack thereof came up as a key concern in some of these neighborhoods that are seeing really significant health disparities in Missoula. And so before we even started on this process, that was a highlight that we were hoping to pick up on and look at this process to see, identify ways that we can use infrastructure to help impact those goals related to health and equity. And then we have guiding principles in this plan. These are a little bit different than the goals. The goals are kind of the big picture, what we're hoping to achieve. The guiding principles are really related to how we're making decisions related to pedestrian infrastructure. So when we're looking at prioritization or what kinds of projects to identify for construction, how do we make those decisions? And these guiding principles are kind of the key elements that we would look at when we're making those decisions. So the process to date, we started a little over a year ago on this planning process. We started with looking at the existing conditions. We did a sidewalk inventory citywide, looking at condition and location. Then we moved into more of a data-driven process of how do we plan for prioritizing sidewalks, what goals, again, are we trying to achieve, and how does that prioritization help us achieve those goals? And then we sort of wrapped up with looking at some different implementation strategies. So what are the challenges we have in doing better with pedestrian infrastructure, and what are some strategies we can potentially use to help us do better? And then over the summer and fall, we've been drafting this document and getting some stakeholder input on reviewing it, and now we have the draft plan that we will hopefully get some additional comments on. So we started this plan looking at, first we approached it that everyone is a pedestrian, and I think this is really key, that regardless of how you move about Missoula in your day-to-day life, at some point you are a pedestrian, whether it's walking from your car to your house, or from at the beginning or the end of your trips, or it's your primary mode of transportation. Everybody is walking or moving as a pedestrian at some point during their day. And so it's really critical infrastructure at a base level. If you don't have good pedestrian facilities, people can't get where they're going. We also wanted to look at a number of different facility types, so it's not just sidewalks that people are using to get around. We have shared use paths and trails that form, in many ways, the backbone of our non-motorized transportation network. There's also creative ways we can accommodate pedestrians, such as shared spaces, or this idea of a WUNRF, where it's primarily a pedestrian facility and it's designed for pedestrians, but you allow other modes such as vehicles. And there's creative ways that we can use those to increase infrastructure, perhaps in a cost-effective way, if it's in the right location and has the right design. So again, the plan is, that's why we call it the Pedestrian Facilities Master Plan, not the Sidewalk Master Plan, because there's more to being a pedestrian than just a sidewalk. So looking at our existing conditions, we started with our sidewalk inventory. We identified where we have sidewalks throughout the city. We used the whole fleet of volunteers to go out and collect this data over 3 to 4 months. They did a very kind of broad scale look at sidewalk condition. Again, this is sort of an average over a block face. It's not very site specific or detailed, or they weren't out there with levels looking to make sure that slopes meet ADA standards or things like that. But it gives us an idea of where we have deteriorating sidewalks generally and where we have new or good condition. So a great example is the Marshall Canyon neighborhood, which primarily includes Canyon River development, and so pretty much all of the development out there is from the last 5 to 10 years, and so all of the sidewalks are new and the condition is really good. You compare that to some of our, do you have a question? Commissioner?
Yeah, so take for instance the poor and fail category. Does that include non-existent? Because I look at the...
No, that's just the so the sidewalk condition is just the existing sidewalks that we have
okay.
today. So if it's This sidewalk condition doesn't include the locations that are just missing sidewalks. That's sort of our other category. So we looked at it in sort of two different ways. We said, where do we have sidewalks and where are they missing? And then where we do have sidewalks, what's the condition of those? We also looked at next slide. We looked at curb ramps. We did an inventory of all of our curb ramps and tried to get some base level information, like do they have truncated domes, or are they older and they're just the straight ramp that probably doesn't meet definitely doesn't meet current ADA standards. So getting a sense of what's the level of ADA connectivity out there in our existing sidewalk network. Does that?
Yeah, what just jumped out at me is Upper Rattlesnake being the leader of the pack there, and wondering, I know there's plenty of sections of roadway with no pedestrian facilities at all, but I guess I was a little surprised to see that has sidewalks that are in terrible condition.
Right, and some of that may, again, we weren't using a scientific process, or we didn't pay a consultant to go out and do a sidewalk condition. This is very general information, but some of those locations might be sidewalks that have been around for a long time, or it's hard to say. Again, as volunteers, this is sort of broad planning level data. I think our goal eventually would be to have, pay someone to go out and do an actual assessment of our sidewalk conditions so that we had it down to even parcel level, where you have heaving, cracking, those kinds of things, and then we could do more in terms of prioritizing the repair. Does that make sense? This was kind of our first attempt at getting a sense of what the sidewalk condition is. Yeah. So we also looked at pedestrian safety. This ties into our community transportation safety plan, where we will also be looking more in depth at safety issues around the community, but we just started with wanting to know where are our pedestrian involved crashes and what are the trends, how safe are people when they're out walking. And you can see there are some locations that have a high concentration of crashes. However, downtown's a great example, but it's also where we have our, by far our highest concentration of pedestrians. So one of the issues that we realized when looking at crash data is we don't have rates for pedestrians, so we don't have good enough count data to say there's X number of crashes per pedestrian trip, like we do with motor vehicles. So it doesn't necessarily mean that downtown is less safe, it just means there's more traffic, there's more pedestrians, there's more opportunities for those crashes to happen, and our goal is to get to the point where maybe we can start to get those rates by doing a more robust traffic count program. So that's one of the recommendations of this plan, is to do better, get better data, be able to evaluate things better, and then make better decisions based on that. But generally, the trend for pedestrian involved crashes is similar to a lot of our other crash data, in that it's going down. We also know that more people are walking, just based on we suspect based on our existing count programs. So anecdotally, I think the hope is that it's getting safer, much like it is for motor vehicle trips, that more people are walking, crashes are going down. Hopefully that's a good trend, and we'll continue that into the future. So we also looked at our existing demand and mode split. So getting back to Jordan's question about how we compare to the rest of the country. So our current trend is a slight increase. So the key takeaway there is that if we continue this current trend, we're definitely not going to meet our ambitious mode share goal. So that's one of the keys of this plan, is to do better, or try to get more people able and willing to use walking as a mode of transportation. But if you compare that with the United States as a whole, on average, we're more than double the rate of people walking to work or school as their mode of transportation. So we're doing good, but we'll need to do a lot better if we're going to meet our goals. I wanted to talk just briefly as part of our existing conditions, just looking at sidewalk costs. This is a question that comes up a lot about how much it costs to build sidewalks. They are certainly not cheap, and they're getting more expensive, much like everything in our lives. But just looking at the last 5 or 6 years worth of costs, the average cost is increasing. It is not going down. I think once you add in 2018, our average cost could be as much as $700,000 or $800,000 per mile of sidewalk to construct it. Again, this is sort of a broad brush. Not every sidewalk project is the same. Some projects are more expensive, some are cheaper. It really depends on the type of sidewalk project and what kind of work you're doing. But generally speaking, costs are going up. The city over the last 6 to 8 years has spent on average $800,000 a year on sidewalk projects. That includes property owner assessments and the city contribution. So we're doing about $800,000 a year in sidewalk projects. If you look at how many miles of missing sidewalks we have, it's 231 miles. That's citywide, so that includes the Upper Rattlesnake, South Hill, sort of all, assuming you had a sidewalk on both sides of every street in Missoula. So you make that calculation, if it costs us $500,000 to $800,000 a mile, we have 231 miles of missing sidewalks. We're on a very slow trend of sidewalk installation. So there's significant issues with, if our goal is to build curb gutter sidewalk on every street, we're certainly not funding it at a rate that is going to complete all of that. Again, keep in mind this doesn't include Missoula or urban renewal districts are building a lot of sidewalks using tax increment funding. There's a lot of private development that is building sidewalks. So as Missoula has more infill and development, it's just hard for us to track that. We don't have a good data system. So again, another one of our recommendations for implementation is establishing some of these data tracking methods to be able to evaluate it better. But there's a significant problem, and this is one of the issues with this plan, is how do we prioritize that limited investment to get the most benefit out of those limited dollars. So that leads us to our priority pedestrian needs analysis. So this was looking at a way to prioritize where to build new sidewalks. We started with wanting to have sort of a data-driven approach. So we have all of these different goals. We can sort of, I guess by proxy, measure them in a number of different ways, such as neighborhoods with low to moderate income households, neighborhoods with higher obesity, neighborhoods with zero-car households, persons with a disability, and older adults, just as a way to measure that social equity and health side. And then we looked at a number of physical built environment factors, such as how close is the area to that project to schools or transit stops or grocery stores or parks, and a number of other destinations, and then looking at relative density. So knowing that if you have a higher density area of development, you're more likely for people to be able to walk to their destinations, just in terms of the distance between housing and employment, and wanting to facilitate, achieving that mode split goal by building facilities in places that would be most likely to accommodate walking trips. So using all of that, we did a fair amount of public process to just figure out how we weight each of those things, because you could do it a lot of different ways. What the public process landed on was about 70% of our weighting for the priority needs was on those demographics or the health and equity measures, and then 30% on the physical locations like parks and schools and other things. That being said, when we get to our map, so we mapped each block and how close it was or its location in relation to all of those things, added up the scores, and then came up with a map of where our highest priority areas are. And what we found was a lot of our missing sidewalks, especially in the core of the city, are located in those higher priority areas, even based on just looking at health and equity. So there's a lot of opportunity within these high priority areas. We're not going to build them all at once. So we have some further recommendations about prioritizing some of those key destinations that we heard from people that are most important, such as schools and transit and parks and trails, as we're selecting projects within these high priority areas. So that's kind of how we approach the prioritization for missing sidewalks. It's also worth looking at the land use relationship. So if you look at where these high priority areas are, the north side, the west side, Franklin to the Fort, when we look at our land use map from the growth policy, the north side, west side, Franklin to the Fort, those are our highest density residential areas where we're planning to potentially have the highest concentration of people or development. And so I think these things, the more we looked at the data and how the priority was playing out, it overlaps, I think, fairly well with our overall growth policy and helping to achieve some of those goals. not just in the growth policy, but our mode split goal, that if we're putting high densities of people in these places, providing the pedestrian infrastructure that allows them to walk to their destinations that we hope will be close by the commercial and jobs and economic centers and transit. So all of these things, the more we looked at how we were prioritizing and some of these other goals, they overlapped better than I think maybe we anticipated early on. So it's good when your data approach overlaps reasonably well with your other goals and assumptions. So we also looked at this as a region-wide plan. It's not just a plan for the city of Missoula. As the MPO, we want to look at other areas outside of city limits. So we tried to think a little bit about what that means for some of these other neighborhoods and come up with just general recommendations about how we would approach pedestrian facilities there, knowing that different areas of the urbanized area of Missoula County are different. So looking at, say, Target Range and Orchard Homes and that community's desire to be and remain more of a rural or suburban neighborhood, and that curb gutter sidewalk on all of those streets might not be the most appropriate or cost-effective way to provide pedestrian facilities. So look at some other designs like shared use paths or those rural designs that might include protected shoulders or other facility types that fit better into a more rural or suburban context. Also looking at East Missoula, Bonner, Milltown, that's more of an urban form currently. It's developed, it's higher density, you have more of a street grid. Depending on how those communities' desires and how they develop in the future, they may be appropriate for curb gutter and sidewalk, but there's also limited right-of-ways, and maybe having some shared streets would be appropriate there as well. And then areas like Mullen Road, west of Reserve, where we're seeing a lot of newer greenfield development and looking at potentially much higher development densities, having development standards that include complete streets and curb gutter, sidewalk, and maybe boulevards, and creating that pedestrian network as we go so that we're not having to come back 50 years from now and do what we're doing in other parts of Missoula that maybe didn't develop with those standards. So then we also looked at intersection analysis, just from the perspective of it's not just sidewalk locations that provide a good pedestrian network, it's also providing the ability to get from one place to another, and intersections are a key part of that. How do you get across collectors, arterials, other facilities? And so we started with this idea that the primary risks to a pedestrian in the street network are the number of lanes you have to cross, the volume of traffic, and the speed of that traffic, and used some of the FHWA guidance about what you would do or what level of intervention you would need to make that a safe crossing. So we tried to look, again, this isn't a scientific approach, but just generally getting a sense of what level of protection our intersections have and how that affects the connectivity of the pedestrian network. We looked at each of those factors, the speed, the volume, and the number of lanes, and then created essentially a risk score. So what is the risk of that intersection? And then looked at the different kinds of improvements such as roundabouts, traffic signals, RRFBs, and down to something as small as a traffic circle. And when you look at all the intersections around Missoula, it's pretty clear where our significant barriers are from going from one neighborhood to another. Again, this isn't scientific. We're not looking at each individual intersection, what the particular safety issues might be, but just getting a general sense of where do we have potentially significant barriers that we could start to reduce with intersection improvements. And I think none of it's particularly surprising. Brooks, Reserve, where we know we don't have a lot of signalized or developed crossings for pedestrians, those could be big barriers for people. And if we want to achieve our goals, we're going to have to start slowly working our way at knocking down those barriers and creating safe ways for people to get across those streets, not just along them or along their local neighborhood routes. So then the final component of this plan is an ADA transition plan, where we looked at the ADA requirements. This is something that's a federal requirement that we have for the right-of-way. So this is just addressing the right-of-way portion of the ADA transition plan. But we wanted to go above and beyond just the required schedule and basic requirements, and really look at what would it take to make our pedestrian network accessible to people of all ages and all abilities, including people in a wheelchair, people who are blind, babies in strollers, sort of the whole breadth of different pedestrian users that we might see out there. So we started with our curb ramp inventory, looking at where we have good connectivity and where we don't. So just because you have a sidewalk does not mean that that neighborhood is accessible, and curb ramps are a key part of making sure that you can get from one location to another. And it really shows us where we have some significant gaps in our existing sidewalk network where we need to do some work. So these maps, all of the red X's are locations where we don't have a ADA improvement. Some locations we just don't have sidewalks, and so as we build sidewalk networks out, we'll get those curb ramps and connectivity. But even in neighborhoods where we have good sidewalk infrastructure, we are missing a significant number of ramps. Yeah, Shane?
Just out of curiosity, the complete intersections, are those completed up to current standards, or are those completed and just could be any standard?
There's just a ramp there.
Okay.
I believe on this map it's complete in that there are ramps on all four corners. Oh, and truncated domes, sorry, yeah. So this would be intersections where we think we're pretty close to, I mean, if there's a truncated dome, it's probably within the last 10 to 12 years, and it's reasonably close to, we might not prioritize those intersections for improvement because they have reasonably good or recent construction, so, yeah. So this will be a little bit of a work in progress, how we use this. We've started looking at network connectivity, you know, like what route would you have to take if you were in a wheelchair to get from one location to another based on existing sidewalks and curb ramps? And it's sometimes surprising how far you would have to go out of your way if you wanted to be on a sidewalk and use a curb, you know, have the appropriate facilities. So it's something that we can use to continue to evaluate, and maybe, you know, the goal someday is to use that data to create maps that you could use to wayfind your way around the city using an ADA accessible route. Seattle has a really cool mapping tool where you can do that, where you can set limits on elevation and ramps and other things, and it will give you the route that you should take to have your accessible path to get from your origin to destination. So. We also, one of the requirements is that we have a schedule for implementing the ADA transition plan. So we looked at a couple of different metrics. One is just installing ADA facilities on all the existing sidewalks in our highest priority categories. Using some really conservative numbers in today's dollars, if we had a 30-year implementation schedule, that's about $80,000 a year that we would invest just in doing those ADA upgrades. To complete our citywide ADA facilities on that same 30-year schedule, would be a little over $500,000 in today's, you know, not counting inflation. So taking that out 30 years, almost $500,000 a year would be necessary to make those improvements. Again, a lot of those curb ramps get installed. Every time we do a sidewalk project, we're upgrading and installing new ramps, so we make progress every year, and I think the city is reasonably good at making sure that we are making progress and making those improvements. The other piece of the plan that we included was making sure that we address not just the minimum requirements, but really think about what are the barriers specific to different kinds of disability. So vision impairments and mobility impairments have very different kinds of barriers, and we can address them in different ways. And there may be some creative solutions out there that we can use to make those improvements. So implementation, this is where we get into trying to think about creative ways that we can do more with less. So just thinking about where we have all of our missing sidewalks and in different neighborhoods and our limits on funding. There's a host of recommendations in this plan that we think will help achieve that. Some of them we may do, some of them we may not, but at least trying to start the conversation about different ways we can increase the rate of implementation of this plan. And they address a lot of different challenges. So we have, you know, in some ways a lack of staff and resources to manage these projects, certainly a lack of funding. The street and pavement condition is an issue. So going in and doing a sidewalk project and putting in curb ramps, if you have an intersection that doesn't meet ADA standards, so the crown of the road is too steep for current standards, there's a lot of work there. Or if you're going in and replacing curb, gutter, and sidewalk, but your street is deteriorating, it doesn't really make sense. So there's a lot of other related issues on these projects. And then just space constraints, right-of-way, lack of labor or contractor capacity in the community, and then how do we achieve some of our other standards, like making sure we have boulevards and street trees in all of our sidewalk projects. So we've tried to organize those implementation recommendations into a series of action steps that we can hopefully start to take to achieve a better pedestrian environment. So that is, I guess, my long-winded overview of the plan. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments or suggestions, anything we can do.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. Mayor Engen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, long-winded. You weren't here last night, were you?
No, I wasn't.
You did just fine, Aaron. So a couple of things. One is, so how does the inventory that was assembled by volunteers compare with our master sidewalk plan? Have we overlaid them? Are we seeing similarities? And
so when you say the master sidewalk plan, that could mean a couple of different things.
Public Works is what I'm talking about, and what we have in the CIP, for example.
Oh, right. So where the projects are? Yeah, you know, that's a good question. I think our prioritization method is different than the previous draft master sidewalk plan, and so you know, we don't necessarily expect that the current CIP would reflect the prioritization process that we have, and it might take a couple of, you know, we're not recommending abandoning those projects and shifting immediately to this, that it might be a couple of years before we start tackling some of these priorities. But there is some overlap. You know, the CDBG project that we did, or that the city put together, addresses a lot of these priorities that we have in this plan, and I think addresses them reasonably well in terms of being in the neighborhoods that have persistent poverty, that provide access to schools and transit and those things. Right. And then as far as the inventory itself of where we have existing sidewalks, you know, I think that matches up really well with the CIP. You know, some of those projects in the CIP are repair and replace, but there are some filling in the gaps. And I think we're all generally using the same data for that.
Well, so one of the things for the city's purposes, this plan and what we do have to align. Mm-hmm. We can't have different priorities and different plans, so mm-hmm. we're going to have to make a policy choice around that. Mm-hmm. I'm also interested in our mode split numbers. When we compare Missoula to the United States, I'm interested in, are those urban areas we're talking about, or is it the whole enchilada?
That's just the whole enchilada, yeah.
Can we get a little more granular and understand similar? I'd much rather compare ourselves to like-sized cities or, right? Yeah,
and that's something that we can put together. We have our annual bike ped count program, and we try to look at a lot of these different data sources, and so that's somewhere where we can pull in those.
I mean, I'm happy to look good, but I want to look good for the right reasons.
Right. Yeah. I think we're better than Bozeman, or we're at least comparable. So I don't know if that.
Then we're good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions or comments? Don?
I guess maybe following up on what the mayor was saying about the policy choice, I kind of see the stuff that you've done as it's super important information for us to understand and know, but there's still like a design choice about what sidewalks we take on to actually make. And I don't think that this report is set up to just be the entire matrix of decision-making around that. And I'm just speaking out loud, and Aaron, you jump in. There'll be a question maybe at the end. But it seems to me that we have so limited amount of resources to invest in these sidewalks that what we need to do is to weigh all the data, see the biggest gaps, and then invest super wisely to be catalytic, connect systems together, not just, respond to where the score was the highest, but use our money to actually connect things so that the system works better.
Yeah,
and that's the part that I'm having a hard time understanding how we're going to make that, use this database and then make that design decision as a community in wise ways. That's the part that I struggle with and I'm interested in your thoughts on.
Yeah, so one of the goals, I guess to step back a little bit, that we approached this plan in part because there was interest from City Council to think differently about how we come up with that list of projects that are in the CIP. And so that was one way they were approaching this, is looking at how you would come up with a decision-making process to identify where those next projects are. We looked, the prioritization map is larger areas, so we're not going to construct all of those in 1 year or 1 5-year CIP, and so there will be some decision-making within those areas. And what we've tried to do is lay out the framework for, in part, how you would do that, so we know that there's a prioritization. The community has an interest in connecting schools and transit, and that the city, I think, to achieve our goals, we have to connect high-density housing with our job centers and providing that way for people to walk. And so the way I would approach this is looking at that priority area, identifying that we want, ideally we're constructing sidewalk projects in those areas because they achieve a lot of our, the most number of our goals. And then looking for those projects within the high priority areas that connect to schools, connect to transit, connect jobs and people. And so you would use those same measures to identify your projects. And again, some of it's going to be opportunistic. We understand that there are other projects, that there's public works projects, street projects, and we can get some efficiency. But this is one more set of data that we can use in those decision-making processes to hopefully get us to not just building sidewalks where we're replacing a water main because we do it, but trying to coordinate those so we're achieving multiple goals with a single project. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it starts to address it. I guess what I noticed in your response was that most of those criteria that you were talking about using as prioritization criteria were in the measures that you developed here, and they're all sort of evenly, it's worth 7.5% to be near transit, or 7.5% to be near a school, and so what you end up with is 8 or 10 different priorities, all equally weighted in this measure. And I think that's the question, is how are we going to actually bump some of those measures up to being that they're defining of what projects we take on. And so the measure like this is sort of identifies hotspots, but it needs another level of political thinking and sort of design thinking in order to be effective.
Yeah.
Marion?
And I totally agree with that, Don. I think, I think we can begin layering some other data sets and maps on top of this. Clearly there are some political decisions to be made, but there are decisions to be made around long-term planning. What is UFTA? We throw an UFTA layer in here, and we look at potential dwelling units. We throw a zoning map and a growth policy on top of this, and we look at commercial development, multifamily. We throw an urban renewal district layer on top of it, and look at our ability to invest much more quickly. And I think when we start piling those layers on, we ought to get a much clearer picture. I mean, to a certain degree, and this is just about capacity as much as it is anything else. Today we have a list of projects, and we're going to check off those projects, march down a path, because they're in the CIP. Yeah. If they're in the CIP, that's what we do. I think this is an opportunity to begin sort of layering all those moving parts and reevaluate that CIP based on all those other factors, because I think there are a lot of them. I think this is one data set that helps inform a broader decision.
Yeah.
And I think on top of that, the city has the water facilities master plan process going on right now, and in an ideal world we would have if we had 10, 100-year-old water mains, we would be digging up the one where the street was also in poor condition and there's no sidewalk and there's street trees that are needed, and we'd bury the utilities at the same time. And I think this sets us up to be able to do that in the future.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, the best we can do from the pedestrian perspective is show where you can get the greatest pedestrian improvement based on that investment. But there are a whole host of other decisions that go into setting up what that CIP is, and we'll have to there's some political choices that need to be made there, and hopefully this plan will be a useful tool to make more impactful investment decisions for the pedestrian environment.
Commissioner?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for all of your work on this. So in the plan, there is a county prioritization section, but I think a conversation that we need to keep having or rekindle is whether there is any misalignment of pedestrian facility standards outside of the city versus within the city, because I think we probably can all think of examples of areas on the periphery of the city of Missoula that eventually come into the city, and then you're struggling with retrofitting or modifying facilities to meet a different set of standards. So all the better if we were able to, at the front end, kind of identify those key areas that, and on the county side, that ought to have similar or identical standards as the city, and that's probably at least initially a staff level conversation between CAPS and development services, but I think it's something that's worth pursuing. Yeah, and we had some of those conversations with county staff and thinking about how we, again, I don't want this plan to become this is the city's annexation plan for here's what areas the city, I just don't know that we have that info. So just trying to look at, I think that's why we approached it from these sub areas of, Mullen Road area, this primarily greenfield. It's likely that will develop to urban city standards, and so that you have different priorities for what kind of facility you would construct, whereas there are other neighborhoods that have no interest or desire to be annexed by the city or have city standards. And so trying to be sensitive to that and not have this plan become a lightning rod of this is an annexation plan for the city, or, but I think we can continue to refine this, and if there are areas where we could add some additional standards or think about that from the future development or status of these areas, we'd be certainly happy to do that. Yeah. I think it's a good comment.
And just from a picky nomenclature standpoint, if you can have a pizza delivered, it ain't rural. So right. So suburban, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, we didn't have a pizza delivery boundary on here, so we'll add that.
It's not original to me, but I love it.
You can't get pizza delivered in Condon? Is that what or maybe that's suburban. Huh?
May well be.
No comment.
Can you touch, I'm looking at table 9 in here on the funding alternatives, and there's a lot of things we've never done here. And I think one thing that's become clear is that at the city level, we're going to have some discussions around funding and around thresholds and whether or not our subsidy model is the right model and we just don't have the levels correct, or whether we need to throw out that model and come up with something new. Can you talk a little bit about what you've got here and maybe what, from your perspective, we need to continue to explore?
Yeah, so the funding alternatives is really just a list of tools that other communities or other plans that we've looked at have recommended or used for helping to fund sidewalks. Again, not all of those will be feasible to do or desirable to do in Missoula, but it at least lays out here's some other options on how we can help fund sidewalks. Knowing that conversation is certainly timely right now, and I think that we're continuing to do some work on evaluating what's the history of funding sidewalks, how are we doing it today, looking at some other alternatives and crafting that strategy, maybe outside of this plan, but as one of the recommendations is looking at funding and how we fund it, knowing there's this huge need, and particularly related to, if we're prioritizing neighborhoods that are lower to moderate income or have some economic and health disparities, what is the appropriate way to fund sidewalks there? Is it all property owner? Is it a different system? And I think that's the same conversation that's been happening at City Council right now. And so we'll continue to work on that and are working on it, and we'll hopefully have some help other city staff come up with some recommendations or options, at least for council to look at. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I think it's just going to be an incredibly complex issue to tackle.
Yeah, but there's no easy solution, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any additional discussion on this item? Or any staff or public comment?
So I guess our plan was to bring this back for adoption in January, depending on, I guess, what happens with conversations at City Council and with the county. We can certainly postpone that if there's more work to be done. Again, our hope is that the draft is close, but if there are significant gaps that we need to do some additional work on, we'll do that and bring it sometime in the spring. I don't want to rush the adoption just to get it adopted. Most of these plans are long-term, so there's no significant hurry to get it done in the next month or two, but that's sort of our timeline currently.
Has TTAC acted on this yet for my recommendation?
We've been doing informational presentations. We did the same presentation for TTAC, got some feedback, and we'll continue to get that staff level and public feedback. So hopefully there's some renewed interest at the community level to participate in this process, and the news around sidewalks right now will enhance our public involvement. So I think it's a good timing for us to have this draft plan and do some more work on it. So yeah, so we'll either be back for adoption in January or February likely.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for all your work on this, and I know Tara and Dave and Michael did a lot of work on this as well, so pass on our gratitude there.
Thanks.
And is there anything further on this item? Any announcements or closing comments? Seeing none, thank you for being here. We'll be adjourned.